In the spring of 1777, nearly 2 years into the American Revolutionary War, the conflict had reached a dangerous stalemate. The British Crown, confident in its vast resources and disciplined armies, still believed the rebellion could be crushed by force. Yet the previous year's campaigns had shown that the 13 colonies were not going to be subdued easily. The British had captured New York City and driven George Washington's army into desperate retreats, but they had failed to deliver the decisive blow that would end the uprising. The rebellion was alive, and worse for Britain, it was spreading. To end the war quickly and restore imperial authority, London approved a bold and ambitious plan to split the colonies in two. The idea was simple but sweeping. If the rebellious New England colonies, seen as the heart and mind of the Revolution, could be isolated from the middle and southern colonies, the rebellion might collapse under its own weight. The Hudson River Valley, stretching deep into the continent from the Atlantic, was the key to that plan. Control of it would sever communication, cripple supply lines, and leave the Continental Army divided and vulnerable. The man chosen to lead this campaign was Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, a charismatic and self-assured officer whose confidence bordered on arrogance. Burgoyne, a veteran of European wars and a man of political influence, believed he could bring the rebellion to its knees in a single season. His plan called for a three-pronged invasion designed to converge on Albany, New York, and crush American resistance there. Burgoyne himself would march south from Canada with a force of British regulars, German auxiliaries, loyalists, and native allies, cutting through the wilderness of northern New York and seizing control of the Hudson River Valley. At the same time, Colonel Barry Street Ledger would advance eastward along the Mohawk River with a smaller force, pressuring American positions from the west. Finally, General William Howe, Commander-in-Chief in North America, was expected to push north from New York City, linking up with Burgoyne and sealing the trap. It was a plan that looked flawless on paper. Burgoyne's army, more than 7,000 strong, was one of the most professional forces Britain had ever sent into the interior of North America. They carried with them field artillery, supply wagons, and engineers capable of building bridges and roads through the wilderness. Their ranks included elite light infantry, grenadiers, and battle-hardened German Brunswickers. The British government and high command believed the very presence of such a formidable column would break American morale and inspire loyalists to rally in support. Many in London were convinced that once New England was cut off, the southern and middle colonies would seek terms rather than face ruin. But the plan depended on perfect coordination across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, something that was far easier to imagine in London than to achieve in the forests of upstate New York. The British underestimated the vastness and difficulty of the terrain they were about to cross, where roads were little more than muddy tracks and rivers could swell into impassable barriers with the rain. They also misjudged the will of the colonists. The rebellion was not confined to a handful of agitators in Boston or Philadelphia. It was fueled by farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, ordinary people with everything to lose and no intention of surrendering their new vision of liberty. Even as Burgoyne's column prepared to leave Canada, American leaders were already anticipating the thrust. Washington, though unable to directly oppose Burgoyne with his main army, urged the northern departments to mobilize militias and disrupt British supply lines. Men like Major General Philip Schuyler and later General Horatio Gates understood that they could not defeat the British in open battle, but they could slow them down, bleed them, and exhaust them long before they reached Albany. As spring turned to summer, Burgoyne's army moved south with pomp and confidence, drums rolling and banners unfurled as they crossed Lake Champlain and seized the crumbling fortress of Ticonderoga in early July. The news sent shockwaves to the colonies, but it also galvanized resistance. Alarm bells rang in New York and New England towns. Militiamen poured out of farms and villages, determined to block the British advance. What began as an orderly campaign on the map was about to evolve into a brutal struggle through swamps, forests, and hostile settlements. The British High Command saw the Hudson River as a highway to victory. In reality, it would become a trap, one that would tighten with every mile Burgoyne marched south. John Burgoyne was the embodiment of British confidence in 1777. A veteran officer, playwright, and politician, he was a man who believed destiny favored him. His charm and eloquence won him influence in Parliament, while his battlefield reputation earned him the nickname Gentleman Johnny. Burgoyne carried himself with the certainty that this campaign would crown his career. He saw the rebellion not as a long, grinding war, but as an insurrection that could be broken by a single, decisive blow, and he was determined to be the man who delivered it. To his mind, the Hudson River expedition would not simply be a military maneuver. It would be a statement of imperial power. The colonies, fragmented and poorly supplied, could never withstand the weight of Britain's professional army, and Burgoyne was convinced that once his forces appeared deep in the interior, the rebellion would crumble under its own weakness. Much of Burgoyne's confidence rested on a series of assumptions, each one flawed, but none of which he doubted. He believed, first and foremost, that loyalists in the region would rally to his standard once they saw a powerful British force advancing from the north. In London, loyalist numbers were routinely exaggerated, and Burgoyne expected thousands of colonists to flock to his banner. With their help, he envisioned a swelling army that would gather strength as it pushed south, overwhelming the scattered and disorganized Continental forces. He also placed enormous faith in his Native American allies. Burgoyne assumed that their presence would instill fear among the rebels and shatter their will to fight. To European military minds, the psychological effect of indigenous warriors was almost as valuable as their combat skills, and Burgoyne anticipated that their raids would scatter militias and disrupt colonial logistics. The third pillar of his strategy, and perhaps the most dangerous, was his belief in speed. Burgoyne was convinced that a rapid march through New York's wilderness would outpace American mobilization. By striking quickly, he hoped to seize key positions before the enemy could react. His columns, he believed, would descend on Albany with such momentum that resistance would be futile. This overconfidence shaped every aspect of his planning, from the size of his baggage train to the pace of his operations. He brought with him more than 30 wagons of personal luggage, including fine wine, china, and silver. He allowed officers to bring their wives and servants. The Army's supply line stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush and weather alike. It did not take long for reality to intrude. The forests and swamps of northern New York were not like the battlefields of Europe. Roads were narrow, muddy, or non-existent. Streams and rivers swelled with spring rains, forcing engineers to build makeshift bridges at every crossing. Clearing paths for artillery and wagons slowed the army to a crawl. Where Burgoyne had envisioned a swift and triumphant advance, he found himself bogged down in a slow, exhausting march that consumed weeks. Supplies that were supposed to last for months dwindled rapidly as the Army's consumption outpaced its transport capacity. Horses died on the march. Wagons broke in the mud. And the loyalist support Burgoyne had counted on failed to appear in any significant number. Instead of thousands rallying to his cause, he found only scattered bands willing to risk their lives for crown. Many loyalists were reluctant to openly support the British until they were sure of victory, and Burgoyne's delays made that victory look less certain with each passing day. Even his native allies, essential to his plans, began to drift away. Their methods of warfare clashed with British discipline, and reports of raids on civilian settlements, including the murder of Jane McCrae, inflamed colonial anger rather than sowing terror. Far from intimidating the population, Burgoyne's alliance with native warriors rallied more men to the Continental cause. The deeper Burgoyne pushed into the wilderness, the more precarious his position became. Every mile stretched the supply lines thinner, and every day gave the Americans more time to organize. What Burgoyne had imagined as a swift march turned into a logistical nightmare, where victory depended not on tactics or bravery, but on whether his men could eat and his horses could pull. By the time he realized that his assumptions were collapsing, it was too late to turn back. Pride and ambition drove him forward. Even as the forest closed in and resistance grew stronger ahead, Burgoyne's gamble was becoming a trap, and the Empire's confidence was about to collide with the brutal reality of a determined enemy and an unforgiving land. The grand expedition that John Burgoyne had envisioned as a swift and triumphant march quickly revealed itself to be something far more grueling and uncertain. In the early weeks of the campaign, the British column, more than 7,000 strong, moved south from Canada with banners flying and drums beating, their confidence undiminished by the weight of the wilderness ahead. But the further they pushed into the wilds of northern New York, the more they realized that this campaign would not be defined by brilliant maneuvers or decisive battles. It would be defined by mud, water, and trees. The The landscape itself became their most formidable enemy, and every mile southward had to be fought for with saws, axes, and sweat long before a single shot was fired at the enemy. The roads that Burgoyne's engineers had hoped to use were little more than deer paths, twisted and overgrown, often vanishing into thick forests that had stood untouched for centuries. What might have been a day's march on open ground became a week-long ordeal of cutting through dense stands of pine and maple just to make a path wide enough for wagons and artillery. Each tree fell slow to column further, and every stretch of road carved from the forest floor sapped the strength of men already burdened by heavy packs and humid summer air. Soldiers accustomed to parade ground precision found themselves wielding axes instead of muskets, hacking a slow, painful route toward Albany. Rivers and streams, swollen by summer rains, proved even more troublesome. The region was crisscrossed by waterways, the Skenny-Sparrow, the Battenkill, the Hudson's many tributaries, and none could be crossed without effort. Each time the army encountered water, engineers were forced to halt the column, build makeshift bridges, or construct rafts strong enough to carry cannons and wagons across. The process consumed precious time and manpower. Horses strained under the weight of the heavy artillery, their hooves slipping in the mud as soldiers laid logs and planks by hand to form roads where none existed. Even small creeks, barely a few yards wide, became serious obstacles when hundreds of men, dozens of cannons, and miles of supply wagons needed to cross them. The sheer size of the British train compounded the problem. Burgoyne's army was accompanied by hundreds of wagons carrying supplies, ammunition, and personal effects, a moving city that stretched for miles. Every halt rippled through the column, turning a brief delay at the front into hours of waiting at the rear. A single broken wheel or a stuck cart could bring the entire expedition to a standstill. When the roads turned to rivers of mud after rainstorms, the wagons sank axle deep, forcing soldiers to harness themselves like beasts of burden to drag them free. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Horses died in the traces. Every inch of progress was paid for with muscle, blood, and time. All the while, the Americans watched and waited. Small bands of militia harassed the column from the forests, felling trees across the roads, burning bridges behind them, and vanishing before the British could retaliate. Supply convoys were ambushed, scouts disappeared in the woods, and loyalist guides often led the army astray. The constant harassment slowed progress even more and forced Burgoyne to detach troops to guard his flanks and rear. He had expected to meet the enemy in battle. Instead, he found himself fighting the land itself, every tree and river conspiring to halt his advance. Weeks turned into months. The campaign that Burgoyne had hoped would sweep south in a matter of weeks crawled forward at a humiliating pace. By late August, the heat of summer began to fade, and with it, the strategic advantage of time. Each day that passed gave the Continental Army more time to organize, more time to gather reinforcements, and more time to dig in along the Hudson Valley. Burgoyne had expected to reach Albany before the leaves began to turn. Instead, by the time his exhausted army emerged from the northern wilderness, autumn had already begun to paint the forests red and gold. Supplies were running low, morale was faltering, and the gap between plan and reality had grown into a chasm. What had begun as a march of conquest now felt more like a siege against nature. Burgoyne's officers, once brimming with confidence, began to question the wisdom of pressing on, but there was no turning back. The army was too deep in enemy territory to retreat, and Burgoyne's pride would not allow it. He pressed forward toward Albany, slower with every mile, unaware that time itself, the most precious commodity of all, was slipping away. By the time the British vanguard sighted the next phase of resistance on the horizon, the momentum of the campaign had already been lost, and the once proud invasion was beginning to look more like a desperate gamble than a path to victory. While Burgoyne's army hacked and dragged its way through the unforgiving forests of northern New York, news of the British advance spread like a spark across the countryside. Riders carried word from village to village, from tavern to church, from one isolated farmstead to the next. The Redcoats were coming down from Canada, thousands strong, and their aim was to cut the colonies in half. The warning reached towns and homesteads still scarred by previous campaigns, places that felt the weight of British occupation or seen their sons fall in earlier battles. It awakened something that had been simmering quietly beneath the surface, a deep, stubborn resolve that this fight was no longer just for liberty in theory, but for survival in practice. The call to arms echoed far beyond the ranks of the Continental Army. Militia companies, loosely organized bands of local men who drilled on village greens and mustered when danger approached, began to form in numbers the British had not anticipated. Farmers who had been tending their harvest put aside their plows and took down their muskets from above the hearth. Blacksmiths left their forges, cobblers their benches, and shopkeepers their counters. In frontier settlements along the Hudson Valley and in the rugged hills of Vermont and New Hampshire, men gathered with whatever weapons they could find: old fowling pieces, hunting rifles, family heirlooms from earlier wars. Many had no uniforms, no bayonets, and little training. But they brought with them something far more dangerous, a belief that this was their land, their homes, and their future to defend. The mobilization was chaotic, but it was also deeply personal. These were not professional soldiers marching under a king's banner. They were neighbors, brothers, and fathers defending their fields, their churches, and the very idea of self-rule. Muster rolls swelled as word of Burgoyne's slow, grinding march reached the interior. New England, long considered the heart of the rebellion, responded with particular intensity. In Massachusetts and Connecticut, town meetings voted to raise new companies of militia. In New Hampshire, John Stark, a veteran of Bunker Hill, rallied volunteers with a promise that they would live free or die. In Vermont, militia commander Seth Warner organized the famed Green Mountain Boys, men hardened by years of defending their land against British claims, now eager to face the Empire's soldiers directly. The American leadership, too, understood the significance of the moment. Major General Philip Schuyler, overseeing the Northern Department, knew that the British had stretched themselves thin and that every day Burgoyne spent hacking through the wilderness was a day the Patriots could use to prepare. Schuyler ordered fortifications strengthened, bridges destroyed, and supplies moved beyond the enemy's reach. By the time Horatio Gates replaced him as commander in August, the network of resistance was already forming. Intelligence networks, carried by scouts and native allies friendly to the Patriot cause, kept the Americans informed of Burgoyne's every move. Guerrilla bands harassed British foraging parties and ambushed supply convoys, forcing Burgoyne to divert troops from his main column just to keep his army fed. The psychological effect of this mobilization was profound. British officers had expected the population to remain passive or even supportive, cowed by the presence of regular troops. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by a population that was not only hostile, but increasingly organized. Every town seemed ready to fight. Every road was watched. Every crossing was contested. The notion that loyalists would rally in large numbers proved a dangerous illusion. Most colonists, even those who had once been neutral, now viewed Burgoyne's advance as a threat to their homes and families. The militia's impact was more than symbolic. At Bennington in mid-August, Stark's men delivered a stunning blow to a British detachment sent to seize supplies. In a fierce engagement fought in fields and woods, the Patriot militia annihilated the force, killing or capturing nearly 1,000 men. It was a small battle by European standards, but its effect on Burgoyne's campaign was catastrophic. He lost valuable troops, failed to replenish his dwindling supplies, and suffered a sharp decline in morale. More importantly, the victory electrified the colonies and convinced thousands more that the tide could be turned. By late summer, the British advance was no longer a steady, unstoppable tide. It was a slow, beleaguered push into a countryside that hated and resisted it at every turn. Burgoyne's columns were growing weaker with each mile, while the Americans grew stronger as every farm and village seemed to add to their ranks. The militias, ragged and ill-equipped as they were, had transformed the war in the North from a simple invasion into a nationwide uprising. They were not just defending their land. They were shaping the course of a revolution. And with every man who stepped out of a workshop or left a field behind to join the fight, the British plan to divide the colonies grew less certain, and the path to Albany became a little longer and a great deal more dangerous. The long, grinding march south reached its first moment of decisive contact on September 19th, 1777, in the rolling fields and dense woods near a small clearing known as Freeman's Farm. Burgoyne's army, worn and delayed by months of logistical struggle, finally approached the entrenched positions of the Continental Army, which had chosen its ground well along the heights near Bemis Heights, on the west bank of the Hudson. General Horatio Gates, who now commanded the Northern American forces, preferred a defensive strategy, determined to let the British exhaust themselves in repeated assaults. But among his subordinates was a man who thought differently, Benedict Arnold, then one of the most aggressive and capable officers in the Continental Army. Arnold believed the best chance of victory was to strike Burgoyne before his full force could deploy. That tension between caution and audacity would shape the day's bloody events. The battle began with movement rather than musket fire. Burgoyne's plan was to advance 3 columns southward, probing the American position and attempting to turn their left flank. His left was composed of German Brunswickers and light infantry advancing to the woods, while the center, the main British force under his direct command, pushed forward across the open ground of Freeman's Farm. The right, under Simon Fraser, maneuvered through thicker forests in an attempt to outflank the Americans. It was a bold plan, but one that stretched his already strained army thin. The wooded terrain, broken by streams and patches of clear farmland, made coordination difficult and communication slow. It was Daniel Morgan's rifle corps that first struck. Morgan, a grizzled frontiersman from Virginia, commanded a band of sharpshooters whose long rifles could hit targets at distances British muskets could not match. As the British vanguard emerged from the trees, Morgan's men opened fire from concealed positions, felling officers and disrupting formations before the enemy could even bring their muskets to bear. British troops, trained to fight in tight formations, found themselves harassed by invisible foes who melted back into the trees after each volley. Officers struggled to maintain order as casualties mounted and momentum stalled. Arnold saw an opportunity and pressed Gates to let him commit more troops to the fight. Reluctantly, Gates agreed, and waves of Continental regulars and militia poured into the woods and fields to meet the advancing British. What followed was not the neat, ordered battle that European officers were accustomed to, but a chaotic and savage contest fought at close range and in broken terrain. Units clashed and separated, firing from behind fences, tree lines, and hastily erected breastworks. The roar of musketry echoed through the clearing as British bayonet charges smashed into American lines, only to be driven back by disciplined volleys and counterattacks. For hours, the battle surged back and forth with neither side able to claim a decisive advantage. At one point, American forces under Colonel Joseph Silly charged directly into the British center, capturing several field pieces before being driven back by a counterattack. Elsewhere, Morgan's riflemen continued to pick off officers and artillery crews, sowing confusion and slowing the British advance. Arnold himself rode into the thick of the fight, rallying men and directing counterattacks with reckless bravery, his presence inspiring troops who might otherwise have faltered under the weight of British discipline. By late afternoon, Burgoyne had committed most of his forces to the field, and the Americans, though outnumbered and often fighting without clear orders, continued to resist fiercely. As dusk approached, the fighting finally tapered off. Both armies held roughly the same positions they had occupied at the start of the day. Technically, Burgoyne could claim a narrow tactical victory. His troops held the field after nightfall, but it was a hollow triumph. His army had suffered nearly 600 casualties, nearly twice the losses of the Americans, and the battlefield was littered with the bodies of British grenadiers, light infantry, and officers. The price of even a partial advance had been steep. The psychological impact of the day was far greater than any tactical result. For the Americans, the battle was proof that they could stand toe-to-toe with the best troops the British Empire could field. Militiamen who had never before faced a bayonet charge had held their ground. Riflemen had humiliated regular infantry with precision shooting. And the Continental Command, often plagued by rivalries and disorganization, had shown it could coordinate a determined defense. Burgoyne, for his part, had expected Freeman's Farm to be a stepping stone on his way to Albany. Instead, it was a warning that every step forward would be contested, that every inch of ground would cost blood, and that his exhausted, dwindling army was running out of both time and men. The battle ended without a clear victor, but it changed the momentum of the campaign. The Americans, far from being intimidated, now believed they could win, and that belief, more than any number of muskets, would shape what was to come. The smoke had barely lifted from the fields of Freeman's Farm when both sides understood that the next phase of the campaign would be fought not in rapid maneuvers, but in a slow, suffocating siege. Burgoyne's army, bruised and bloodied from its inconclusive clash on September 19th, had failed to break the Continental line. The road to Albany, which he had once imagined as a swift and unstoppable march, now lay blocked by an entrenched enemy. Worse still, the logistical strain that had dogged his expedition from the beginning was becoming critical. Supply wagons that were supposed to replenish his troops were still miles to the north, vulnerable to American raids and delays. Foraging parties sent into the countryside returned empty-handed or did not return at all. Horses were dying, rations were dwindling, and ammunition stocks were shrinking. Every day the British remained in place. Their situation grew more precarious. Faced with the grim reality that he could neither advance nor retreat without risking annihilation, Burgoyne ordered his men to dig in. Defensive work sprang up across the high ground north of the American positions. Earthen redoubts, abatis made from felled trees, and shallow trenches meant to slow an enemy advance. Artillery was in place along ridge lines overlooking likely approaches, and the once proud expeditionary force became a stationary army behind hastily built fortifications. Soldiers who had expected to be marching toward glory now spent their days hauling timber, piling earth, and reinforcing lines they hoped they would not have to defend. The forest around Freeman's farm echoed, not with the crack of muskets, but with the thud of shovels and the groan of wagons hauling logs. Across the lines, Horatio Gates and his Continental troops were not idle. Encouraged by their performance in the battle and by the visible British hesitation, they moved quickly to tighten the noose. Reinforcements poured into the American camp from New England and the Hudson Valley, swelling the ranks day by day. What had begun as a force of a few thousand men had grown to more than 10,000, a mixture of Continental regulars, state militias, and rifle companies. Their encampment spread to the woods like a living organism, tents rising among the trees, cook fires burning in long rows, powder magazines, and supply depots appearing where days earlier there had been only forest floor. The Americans deepened their own defenses, digging trenches, constructing artillery batteries, and positioning riflemen to watch every movement within the British camp. From their forward positions, American scouts and pickets could see that the British were struggling. Foraging parties ventured farther afield, often returning under fire or not at all. Patrols reported that British soldiers were slaughtering horses for food and that ration sizes had been cut. Disease, always a lurking threat in any encampment, began to spread through Burgoyne's camp as sanitation deteriorated. Letters sent north to Canada pleaded for reinforcements or resupply, but none came. The long distance and hostile territory made meaningful support nearly impossible. Morale within Burgoyne's ranks began to falter. Officers who had once shared their commander's confidence now voiced doubts about the campaign's future. Rumors circulated that Howe's army in New York had moved south toward Philadelphia instead of marching north to join them, a decision that shattered the central premise of Burgoyne's grand plan. The troops knew they were alone, deep in enemy territory, with no clear path forward and no secure line of retreat. The Redcoats, who had marched south with drums and banners, now spent their nights listening to sounds of unseen Americans moving in the woods around them. For the Continentals, the tightening siege was more than a tactical opportunity. It was a psychological turning point. They no longer saw themselves as a desperate insurgent force. They were now the army in control, dictating the tempo of the campaign, forcing the British to react rather than command. Gates's strategy was cautious but effective. Hold the lines, keep pressure on the British, and let time and hunger do their work. Every day the British remained trapped. The American position grew stronger and their enemy weaker. By early October, Burgoyne's army was a shadow of the force that had crossed the Canadian frontier with such confidence just months before. His men were exhausted, hungry, and increasingly demoralized. Their supply lines were severed, their allies absent, their hopes of reinforcement fading. Around them, the forest closed in, filled with riflemen, artillery, and a growing sense that the noose was tightening. The battle at Freeman's farm had been a bloody draw, but the struggle that followed was slowly, inexorably turning against the British. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, sitting behind their earthworks as an enemy army swelled around them, waiting for the moment to strike. The campaign that was supposed to end the rebellion was now itself on the verge of being swallowed by it. By the time the leaves around Saratoga had begun to turn, The nature of the war in the North had changed completely. What had once been a campaign of British initiative and momentum had transformed into something Burgoyne had never expected. A siege conducted not by a small, scattered insurgency, but by a growing, coordinated army that was steadily closing its grip around his exhausted forces. The troops that had gathered in the hills and forests were not the ragged handful of militias that British commanders had dismissed at the start of the war. They were thousands strong now. Farmers and cobblers, hunters and blacksmiths, tradesmen and veterans alike, all converging with a singular purpose: to trap and break the British army that had dared to march so deep into their homeland. By early October, more than 5,000 Continental regulars and militia had assembled near Saratoga. Their ranks grew almost daily as fresh companies from New England, New York, and beyond answered the call. Some came marching in uniform beneath regimental banners. Others arrived in homespun clothes, carrying muskets that had belonged to their fathers. Many were young and untested, and their training was crude compared to the drill precision of the British line infantry. But what they lacked in discipline, they more than made up for in resolve. These were not mercenaries fighting for pay or empire. They were men defending their homes, their families, and an idea of liberty that had taken root too deeply to be stamped out. The humiliation of occupation, the memory of burned towns, and the stories of British arrogance and cruelty had turned their anger into iron. The growing American army was more than just a mass of bodies. Under Horatio Gates's cautious but deliberate leadership, and with aggressive field commanders like Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan pushing for offensive action, they were being shaped into a coordinated fighting force. The days when militia units fought independently, striking when they pleased and retreating when they tired, were fading. Now they drilled beside Continental regulars, learned to hold the line, to load and fire by command, and to follow orders with discipline. Supply wagons began to arrive with powder and rations. Artillery was hauled into place on the ridges, and engineers built fortifications that turned the surrounding hills into a fortress. From the British camp, scouts brought back increasingly grim reports. Where once there had been a few scattered encampments, now there were sprawling rows of tents. Campfires dotted the hills at night, like a constellation of defiance. Riflemen were spotted in the woods. Pickets crept ever closer to British outposts, and patrols began to vanish into the trees, never to return. Burgoyne had marched south, expecting to face a rebellion on the run. Instead, he was surrounded by an army that grew stronger with every passing day, its ranks swelling beyond what his shrinking force could hope to match. The psychological shift on both sides was impossible to ignore. For the Americans, the sheer size of their assembled forces was a revelation. Only months earlier, many of these men had doubted whether they could stand against British regulars in open battle. Now they looked across the lines and saw an enemy trapped, hungry, and increasingly desperate. The idea that the world's most powerful army could be beaten no longer seemed a fantasy. It felt real, tangible, and close at hand. The confidence of the Continental camp hardened into determination, and discipline improved as the men understood the stakes. They were not just defending their land anymore. They were on the verge of capturing an entire British army. For Burgoyne, the swelling American force was a nightmare. His intelligence report spoke of thousands upon thousands of enemy troops, perhaps twice his own number. Reinforcement from the south under General Howe were nowhere in sight, and his own supply line was now entirely severed. Each day that passed saw his perimeter shrink as the Americans crept closer, digging trenches, positioning cannons, and probing for weaknesses. His once proud army, the best troops Britain could field in the colonies, was now trapped on a patch of hostile ground, surrounded by men he had dismissed as undisciplined rabble. The transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a scattered rebellion had become a national war effort. What had once been militia skirmishes and partisan raids had evolved into a coordinated military campaign. And what had once seemed impossible, the encirclement and surrender of a British field army, now appeared not only possible but inevitable. The Americans had ceased to be a nuisance to imperial power. They were now the dominant force in the North, poised to deliver a blow that would reverberate across the Atlantic. And as Burgoyne looked out from his earthworks at the growing sea of enemy tents, he understood that the siege tightening around him was not just physical. It was a weight of a revolution that had grown far beyond what he had ever imagined. By early October, Burgoyne knew he was running out of options. His army was encircled, his supplies dwindling, and his hopes for reinforcements long gone. Each day the American lines grew stronger and closer, their cannon more numerous, their numbers swelling beyond anything he had anticipated. The British commander understood that remaining idle meant eventual surrender by starvation and exhaustion. In desperation, he resolved to strike first, to test the strength of the American positions with a limited attack that might open a path of retreat or at least relieve the suffocating pressure of the siege. It was a gamble born not of confidence but of necessity, and it would prove to be the final undoing of his once grand campaign. On the morning of October 7th, 1777, Burgoyne assembled a force of about 1,500 men, including British regulars, German Brunswickers, Canadian auxiliaries, and Loyalist volunteers. Their objective was to probe the American left flank, disrupt its lines, and perhaps seize a more defensible position from which to continue the fight. They marched cautiously from their entrenchments near the Hudson, advancing through brush and open farmland toward the heights where the Continental Army was entrenched. Burgoyne hoped to catch the Americans unprepared. Instead, they were waiting. Horatio Gates, though often criticized for his caution, had been anticipating just such a move. American scouts had reported British movements as soon as they began, and sharpshooters and skirmishers under Daniel Morgan quickly took up concealed positions in the woods. As Burgoyne's men entered the fields below Bemis Heights, they were met with a withering volley of rifle fire that threw their ranks into confusion. British officers attempted to rally their men into line, but Morgan's riflemen kept them pinned down, picking off officers and artillery crews before they could properly deploy their guns. The engagement escalated rapidly as Continental and militia units surged forward to press the advantage. Cannon roared from hidden positions, blasting gaps in the British formations, while waves of American infantry advanced through the woods, firing from behind trees, fences, and earthen banks. Burgoyne's probing force, intended only to test the enemy's strength, suddenly found itself in a pitched battle it could not win. Redcoats fought stubbornly to hold their ground, but the weight of fire and numbers against them was too great. In the midst of the chaos, Benedict Arnold, now seething with frustration over Gates's reluctance to pursue an aggressive strategy, made a decision that would define the battle. Though Gates had ordered him to remain in camp, Arnold mounted his horse and rode into the thick of the fighting without permission, shouting commands and rallying wavering regiments. He transformed what had been a scattered skirmish into a furious, coordinated counterattack. His energy and audacity galvanized the American line. Soldiers who had been advancing cautiously now surged forward with renewed determination, driving into the British positions with relentless momentum. Arnold's leadership turned the tide completely. American forces stormed a key position known as the Bucharest Redoubt, overwhelming its defenders after brutal close-quarters fighting. British lines began to buckle under the pressure, and entire units started to fall back in disarray. Arnold pressed on, personally leading assaults deep into the enemy position, even after his horse was shot from under him and he was wounded in the leg. His actions that day, reckless, defiant, and brilliant, broke the cohesion of Burgoyne's field force and sent panic rippling through the British ranks. By late afternoon, the Redcoats were in full retreat, stumbling back toward their fortified camp under relentless American fire. Burgoyne's probing attack had failed completely, achieving none of its objectives and costing him nearly 600 men, losses he could not replace. The British commander's hopes of breaking the siege evaporated as his exhausted troops withdrew behind their defenses, demoralized and shaken. The once proud British expeditionary force now found itself huddled in its entrenchments, surrounded and with no prospect of escape. For the Americans, the victory at Bemis Heights was more than just a tactical success. It was proof that they had transformed from an improvised militia into a disciplined, capable army that could defeat Britain's finest troops in open battle. The psychological impact was enormous. Confidence surged through the ranks, and talk of final victory spread through the camps. The Redcoats, who had once seemed invincible, were now beaten, bleeding, and on the verge of surrender. Burgoyne's gamble had backfired spectacularly. Rather than breaking the siege, he had sealed his fate. His army was weaker than ever, his supplies nearly gone, and the enemy around him stronger and more emboldened with each passing day. The tide of the Saratoga campaign had turned decisively, and the dream of a swift British victory in the north had vanished amid the smoke and chaos of Bemis Heights. What remained now was the grim reality of surrender, and the dawning recognition that the British Empire's grip on its rebellious colonies had been fatally weakened. The defeat at Bemis Heights shattered any illusions Burgoyne still held about regaining the initiative. His probing attack had been crushed, his best troops were exhausted, and morale had sunk to its lowest point since the campaign began. What remained was once proud expeditionary force huddled behind hastily reinforced earthworks, hungry, weary, and hemmed in on every side by an enemy that seemed to grow larger and bolder with each passing day. The plan that had seemed so brilliant in London, a triumphant march down the Hudson, the severing of New England from the other colonies, and the collapse of the rebellion, was now in ruins. Burgoyne was not an advancing conqueror anymore. He was a commander trapped deep in enemy territory, his choices narrowing with every sunrise. The situation was grim. The most obvious path of escape, south toward Albany, was now impossible. American forces had entrenched themselves along the river and blocked every conceivable route. Militia units swarmed the countryside, patrolling roads, bridges, and river crossings, their numbers growing daily. Even the most isolated paths were guarded by riflemen who knew the terrain far better than any British officer. Scouts sent south rarely returned, and those who did brought back grim news. The way was sealed. Horatio Gates and his commanders had methodically prepared for this moment. They knew that if they could contain Burgoyne where he stood, starvation and attrition would do the rest. The prospect of retreating north was no better. The route back to Fort Ticonderoga, the path Burgoyne's army had taken in its confident advance just months earlier, was now hundreds of miles of hostile territory. American detachments had destroyed bridges and felled trees across roads to make the return journey nearly impossible. Fords across rivers were under constant watch. Scouts reported that even attempts to send messengers north were met with ambushes and gunfire. The Iroquois and Loyalist guides who had once aided the British advance were gone, many having deserted or been driven off as the tide of war shifted. Burgoyne's supply convoys, already vulnerable during the march south, now faced certain capture if they tried to reach him. There would be no relief column, no resupply, no reinforcement. Desperate to break free from the tightening noose, Burgoyne ordered several probing movements in early October, hoping to find a weak spot in the American lines. Each one ended in failure. When British light infantry attempted to secure a crossing on the Hudson under cover darkness, they were met with devastating fire from American riflemen hidden in the tree-line. A German detachment sent to scout a northern escape route returned bloodied and demoralized, having stumbled into a series of ambushes laid by local militia. Even small foraging parties, once essential for keeping the army fed, became suicide missions. Dozens of British soldiers were killed or captured each time they ventured beyond the safety of their entrenchments. Inside the British camp, the situation grew worse by the day. Supplies were almost gone. Rations had been cut again and again until men were living on little more than meager portions of flour and salted meat. Horses, once used to haul artillery, were slaughtered for food. The sick and wounded filled makeshift hospitals, and disease spread in the cramped conditions. Discipline began to erode as despair set in. Officers struggled to keep order among men who had once marched with unshakable confidence, but now whispered openly about surrender. From the American lines, the transformation was visible. Their own numbers continued to grow, with militia and reinforcements arriving from New England and the Hudson Valley almost daily. Every approach was watched, every trail covered, every crossing defended. Riflemen perched in trees and behind stone walls, ready to open fire on anything that moved beyond the British works. Small groups of scouts crept ever closer to the enemy camp, harassing sentries and cutting off contact with the surrounding countryside. Burgoyne's once formidable army, which had boasted thousands of disciplined soldiers and a powerful train of artillery, was now a besieged and isolated force, surrounded by a militia that had learned how to fight and was unwilling to let its prey escape. The psychological toll was enormous. Burgoyne, once so confident, now spent long hours poring over maps with his staff, searching in vain for a solution. There was none. Every route was blocked. Every escape was anticipated. Even the possibility of fighting breakout, a desperate charge through enemy lines, seemed suicidal. The Continentals held the high ground, controlled the crossings, and outnumbered him nearly 2-1. Each day he remained trapped made his position weaker and the Americans stronger. By mid-October, Burgoyne understood the truth. His army was no longer an expeditionary force. It was a trapped column with no way forward, no way back, and no hope of salvation. What had begun as a grand plan to end the rebellion had turned into a humiliating stalemate. Surrounded, starving, and out of options, Burgoyne's thoughts turned reluctantly to the one course he had sworn he would never take: surrender. The Empire's Northern Army, once sent to crush a revolution, now waited for terms from the very rebels it had come to destroy. The slow strangulation of Burgoyne's army was not marked by dramatic battles or thunderous cannon fire, but by the daily, grinding misery that consumed the camp. As the days dragged on into mid-October, the British found themselves trapped in a shrinking patch of ground, their situation deteriorating with every hour. The confident march that had begun months earlier from Canada, with drums beating, banners flying, and columns of well-supplied troops, had ended here, in a damp and muddy encampment surrounded by enemies. The men who had once spoken of glory and victory now spoke only of food, shelter, and survival. Supplies had always been a problem on the long march south, but now they were gone entirely. The last of the bread and flour had been issued, and the barrels of salted meat that had once lined the wagons were empty. Rations were cut repeatedly until soldiers were receiving little more than a handful of flour or a scrap of dried beef each day. Hunger gnawed constantly, sapping strength and morale alike. Men boiled leather from old harnesses to make a thin, bitter broth. They scoured the ground for edible plants. When that was not enough, and it never was, they turned to the only remaining source of sustenance left to them: their own horses. The slaughter of horses began quietly at first, reserved for those too weak to pull wagons or carry loads. But soon, even the strongest animals were butchered, their meat divided into tiny, desperate portions that barely kept men alive. What had once been proud cavalry mounts and sturdy draft animals now disappeared from the picket lines one by one, replaced by the acrid smell of roasting flesh rising from campfires. The sound of horses being shot and butchered became a daily ritual, a grim reminder how far the mighty British Army had fallen. As hunger weakened the men, disease followed close behind. The camp, crowded and unsanitary, became a breeding ground for illness. Dysentery swept through the ranks, leaving men doubled over with fever and dehydration. Smallpox and typhus, constant threats in 18th century armies, claimed the weakest and the wounded. The makeshift hospitals overflowed with men too sick to stand, their groans echoing through the night. Doctors could do little more than offer water and prayers. Supplies of medicine were as depleted as food, and even the most basic care was impossible. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical one. Soldiers who had once marched with confidence now huddled in their tents, hollow-eyed and shivering against the cold autumn rains. The endless damp turned the ground beneath them into a sea of mud, soaking through uniforms and rotting boots. Fires sputtered and died under the weight of the weather, and men slept in the muck with empty stomachs and little hope. The grand talk of victory and imperial destiny that filled the air in June had vanished entirely. Now, conversations revolved around rumors of possible reinforcements, of American weaknesses, of some miracle that might still save them. But each passing day made those hopes feel more like fantasies. Officers struggled to maintain discipline, but even among them, despair had taken root. Arguments broke out in command tents over the next course of action. Some urged a desperate breakout. Others pleaded for surrender to avoid total annihilation. Burgoyne himself, once so sure of his own brilliance, was now gaunt and sleepless, pacing his quarters deep into night as he contemplated the impossible situation he faced. His letters to his superiors grew increasingly bleak, filled with acknowledgments that his army was on the brink of collapse. Across the lines, the Americans watched and waited. They saw the dwindling number of horses, the lack of patrols, the sagging tents. They intercepted deserters, British soldiers who risked execution to escape the starvation and sickness in their camp. Each one told the same story. The army was starving, disease was rampant, and morale was collapsing. The once formidable British force, feared across the globe for its discipline and strength, had been reduced to a desperate, demoralized mass clinging to life in the mud. In those final days before the inevitable surrender, the Redcoats hardly resembled the army that had marched south in such splendor. Their bright coats were caked with filth and torn from weeks of hardship. Their weapons, once polished and gleaming, rusted in their hands. The proud formations that had terrified opponents from Europe to India were gone, replaced by scattered, skeletal figures too weak to stand in ranks. They no longer looked like conquerors. They looked like survivors, and barely that. Hunger had broken their bodies, disease had hollowed their ranks, and despair had eroded the discipline that had once made them the pride of an empire. All that remained was a final humiliation, a reckoning they could no longer hope to avoid. By mid-October, the weight of reality could no longer be ignored. Burgoyne's army was not merely beaten, it was finished. The men were starving, disease was spreading unchecked, and any hope of relief had long since vanished. Reinforcements from the south under General Howe were nowhere near. The road north was impassable, clogged with fallen trees, and lined with hostile militia. Every attempt to scout a way out ended in ambush. His soldiers, once proud and disciplined, were gaunt, sick, and demoralized, their red coats now little more than rags clinging to their bodies. Even his officers, once confident and defiant, had begun to speak openly of the inevitable. Burgoyne had led them deep into the heart of rebellion, and now he could no longer lead them out. The decision to seek terms was not made lightly. For a British general to surrender to an enemy force, and not just any enemy, but a band of colonial rebels the empire had dismissed as disorganized farmers, was unthinkable. It had never happened before. The mere idea was an affront to everything the British Army represented: tradition, discipline, and imperial power. But no matter how hard Burgoyne searched for alternatives, none existed. His army could not break through the American lines. It could not retreat, and it could not survive where it was. The choice was between surrender and annihilation. In the cold dawn of October 13th, Burgoyne requested a parley. A white flag was raised over the British camp, and messengers rode to the midst of the American lines with a formal request to negotiate. Across the way, Horatio Gates had been waiting for this moment. He knew the British were broken, and he knew time was on his side. The Americans could afford to wait. Burgoyne could not. Gates agreed to talks, and soon officers from both sides met between the lines in a small clearing, the ground still scarred from the fighting of weeks past. The air smelled faintly of smoke and gunpowder, and the distant sound of hammers rang through the trees as the Americans continued to strengthen their siege works even as negotiations began. The initial terms Burgoyne proposed were bold, almost defiant. He suggested that his army be allowed to withdraw with its honor intact, muskets in hand, colors flying, and a promise not to fight again in North America. Gates rejected this immediately. The Americans held every advantage, and they saw no reason to offer concessions to an enemy who had no leverage. The talks stretched on for days, with each side exchanging proposals and counterproposals. But as the situation in the British camp worsened, as rations ran out completely, as men collapsed from hunger, as the sick died by the dozens, Burgoyne's position grew weaker by the hour. By October 16th, the negotiations had entered their final stage. The Americans were willing to accept a convention, a formal agreement under which Burgoyne's army would surrender its arms and be escorted to Boston, where they would embark on ships to return to Europe on the condition they would not serve again in the war. It was a humiliating offer, one that stripped Burgoyne of any pretense of victory or even parity. He would not be allowed to march out with his colors. His artillery and weapons would be surrendered. His men, thousands of them, would be paroled prisoners, their fate determined by a rebel Congress. For Burgoyne, the decision was agony. His career, his reputation, and the pride of the British Army itself hung in the balance. To capitulate to rebels was an unprecedented disgrace, one that would be remembered in London's political and military circles for decades. Yet as he walked through his camp and saw the skeletal faces of his soldiers, their once polished muskets now rusted and useless, he knew there was no other course. To refuse the terms would mean the destruction of his entire force and the pointless slaughter of men who had already endured far too much. On the evening of October 16th, as campfires flickered weakly against the cold autumn air, Burgoyne summoned his senior officers. They gathered in his tent, silent and grim, as he read aloud the final agreement. There was no debate. The decision had been made. The army that had marched into New York to crush a rebellion would instead lay down its arms before it. Outside, the air was heavy with smoke from dying fires and a faint crack of musket shots from distant pickets. But no one doubted what would happen next. The war in the North, at least for this campaign, was over. A British general was about to surrender not to a European rival, not to a great empire, but to the very people his king had dismissed as traitors and farmers. The humiliation was total, and yet, for Burgoyne and his starving men, it was also a mercy. The morning of October 17th, 1777, dawned gray and still over the fields near Saratoga. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, and a low mist clung to the ground as if reluctant to rise. In the British camp, there was no drumbeat, no shouted orders, no display of imperial pride. Instead, there was only silence, the kind that settles over an army that knows its fate has been sealed. After months of marching, fighting, starving, and dying, General John Burgoyne's campaign had reached its final moment. The terms had been agreed upon. There would be no breakout, no last desperate stand. The proud expeditionary force of the British Empire was going to surrender. At the appointed hour, British and German troops began to form ranks for the last time. Their uniforms were tattered and caked with mud, their faces hollow from hunger, but they still marched with what dignity they could muster. Officers straightened their coats and polished their boots, determined to meet defeat with some remnant of the discipline that had once carried them across continents. Burgoyne himself, pale and visibly weary, rode at the head of the column. He had dressed deliberately that morning, choosing his finest uniform, a gesture less of vanity than of defiance, a final act of control over a situation that had long since slipped beyond his command. Across the field, the American army waited in solemn silence. There were no cheers, no jeers, no cries of triumph. Gates had ordered his men to stand quietly and show respect for the moment. It was not a time for celebration, but for reflection. They knew the weight of what was about to happen. They were not merely witnessing the surrender of an enemy force. They were watching the course of the entire war change before their eyes. For many of them, farmers and tradesmen who had left their homes to fight for a cause that often felt fragile and uncertain, the sight of a British army about to lay down its arms was almost beyond comprehension. One by one, the regiments of Burgoyne's army crossed into the clearing designated for the ceremony. Muskets were stacked in neat rows, bayonets removed and placed carefully on the ground. Cannon, once symbols of British might, were rolled forward and abandoned, their barrels pointed uselessly toward the sky. The regimental colors, banners that had once led these men into battle across Europe, were furled and carried silently to the rear. It was a ritual stripped of glory, a pageant of defeat performed before an enemy that had once been dismissed as little more than a mob of farmers. For the Americans watching, the most striking part of the surrender was the sheer scale of it. Nearly 5,800 British and German soldiers, almost the entire expeditionary force, marched out and laid down their arms. Many were too weak to stand for long, their steps faltering as they filed into captivity. Others stared straight ahead, refusing to meet the eyes of the men who had defeated them. A few wept openly. But all of them knew they were now prisoners of war, subject to the mercy of a nation they had been sent to crush. Burgoyne and Gates met once more beneath a white tent pitch between the lines. The two men exchanged formal courtesies, each aware of the historical significance of the moment. Burgoyne, ever the gentleman, offered his sword as a token of surrender. Gates, following the custom of honor, refused to accept it and instead returned it, a silent acknowledgment of his adversary's dignity even in defeat. The two generals then signed the final documents of capitulation. The ink that dried on that parchment did more than end a single campaign. It reshaped the entire trajectory of the war. The surrender at Saratoga was more than a military victory. It was a turning point. For the first time, a full British field army had capitulated to colonial forces. The myth of British invincibility, the idea that a handful of poorly equipped rebels could never stand against the world's most powerful empire, lay shattered on that field. Word of the victory spread quickly across the colonies, igniting celebrations from New England to the Carolinas. It reached Europe within weeks, convincing France that the American cause was not only just but winnable. Within months, French diplomats would sign treaties of alliance and commerce, transforming a colonial rebellion into an international war. As the defeated British soldiers were marched away under guard and the Americans returned to their camps, the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Nothing about the war would ever be the same. The surrender on that quiet autumn morning marked the end of Burgoyne's campaign, but it also marked the beginning of something far larger, the rise of an independent America. The balance of power had shifted, and the world would never look at the rebellion the same way again. The soldiers who had laid down their muskets and the ones who had stood silently to watch them knew they had witnessed something history would remember forever. When word of Burgoyne's surrender crossed the Atlantic and reached London in the winter of 1777, it hit the heart of the British Empire like a cannon blast. The news arrived slowly, carried first by merchant ships and then confirmed by official dispatches. But by the time the full scale of the disaster was known, disbelief had turned into humiliation. A British field army, more than 5,800 soldiers, including some of the finest regulars and veteran German auxiliaries, had capitulated to colonial rebels in open battle. It was an outcome that the empire's generals, ministers, and monarch had never seriously considered possible. The British Army was the most disciplined and powerful force in the world. Its officers were veterans of decades of global conflict. And yet, on a muddy field in upstate New York, they had been surrounded, starved, and forced to surrender to an enemy that London had dismissed as disorganized and incapable. The reaction in Parliament was immediate and furious. News of Saratoga dominated debate for weeks, as the opposition seized on the defeat as evidence that the government's entire strategy in America was flawed. Ministers were shouted down, and the House of Commons echoed with accusations of incompetence, arrogance, and failure. The blame game spread quickly. Some MPs accused Lord George Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, of gross mismanagement and poor coordination, particularly his failure to ensure that General Howe marched north to meet Burgoyne. Others attacked the king's advisors for underestimating the scale and determination of the rebellion. There were calls for inquiries, resignations, and even for the government to sue for peace before more British lives and treasure were lost. The press, too, was merciless. Pamphlets and newspapers mocked the idea that a handful of farmers could never stand against Britain's might, pointing to Burgoyne's defeat as proof that the empire had misjudged its enemy. Political cartoons circulated showing King George III watching helplessly as America slipped from his grasp. Writers compared Saratoga to the worst defeats in British history, disasters that had toppled ministries and reshaped foreign policy. The humiliation was not confined to Parliament or the press. Across London's clubs, drawing rooms, and taverns, conversation turned grim. Merchants fretted about the war's spiraling costs. Bankers worried about the stability of imperial finances. Ordinary citizens, once confident that the rebellion would be crushed quickly, now doubted whether victory was possible at all. Within the halls of government, the defeat forced a painful reassessment of Britain's entire approach to the war. The original plan, a swift, decisive campaign to isolate New England and crush the rebellion piecemeal, was now in ruins. Burgoyne's surrender had exposed the weaknesses in British strategy: overextended supply lines, poor coordination between commanders, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the colonists' will to fight. The assumption that loyalist support would tip the balance had proven disastrously wrong. Far from rallying to the crown, many loyalists had remained neutral or even joined rebellion when they saw that the British could be defeated. The political consequences for King George III were profound. Though the king remained resolute in his desire to subdue the colonies, pressure on him grew from all sides. Moderates in Parliament argued that the war was unwinnable and called for negotiations with the Continental Congress. They pointed to Saratoga as evidence that the Americans were not a disorganized mob, but a determined and increasingly capable military force. Even some of the king's most loyal supporters began to waver, questioning whether continuing the war was worth the risk of further humiliation and the potential loss of Britain's other colonial holdings. Internationally, the shock waves were even more significant. European powers had been watching the American conflict closely, skeptical of the colonists' chances, but eager to exploit British weakness. France, Britain's old rival, saw in Saratoga decisive proof that the rebellion might succeed. French diplomats, who had hesitated to fully commit to the American cause, now began negotiations in earnest, laying the groundwork for an alliance that would change the balance of the war. Spain and the Dutch Republic, too, began to reconsider their positions, sensing an opportunity to weaken British dominance on the global stage. For Britain, the defeat at Saratoga was more than a battlefield setback. It was a strategic and psychological earthquake. It shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and forced the empire to confront the reality that the war in America would not end quickly, cheaply, or easily. It would require a complete rethinking of objectives, alliances, and commitments. And even then, there was no guarantee of success. The momentum that had once seemed to belong entirely to Britain now shifted decisively to the colonies. The rebellion was no longer a minor uprising on the fringes of the empire. It was a full-scale war for independence, and for the first time it seemed possible, perhaps even likely, that Britain might lose. The ripples from Saratoga did not stop in London. Across the English Channel, in the glittering halls of Versailles, the news of Burgoyne's surrender was greeted not with outrage, but with opportunity. France, humiliated less than 2 decades earlier in the 7 Years' War and stripped of much of its colonial empire by British hands, had been watching the American rebellion with cautious interest since its outbreak. Sympathy for colonial cause was widespread among French intellectuals and military men, and the chance to weaken Britain, the great rival that had dominated European politics for a century, was too tempting to ignore. Yet, until Saratoga, hesitation prevailed. Many in King Louis XVI's court doubted that the Americans could sustain their rebellion long enough to justify a risky alliance. Supporting them too early could mean wasting French treasure and blood on a lost cause. But the surrender of an entire British army to colonial forces changed everything. Suddenly, the impossible seemed possible. The American colonies had proven they could defeat British regulars in open battle, and not just in a skirmish, but in a major campaign. The notion that the rebellion was destined to collapse under the weight of British power no longer held. French diplomats, who had maintained unofficial contact with American envoys for years, now pressed for a more formal alliance. In Benjamin Franklin, who had charmed the French elite with his wit, humility, and revolutionary zeal, they found a willing and persuasive partner. Franklin's message was simple. With French support, the rebellion could succeed. Without it, the colonies might fall back under British rule. The French foreign minister, Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, was one of the most ardent advocates for intervention. He argued that Britain's humiliation at Saratoga presented a rare chance to tip the balance of global power. By aiding the American cause, France could strike a blow at its greatest rival without directly declaring war. At least not immediately. It could drain British resources, stretch its navy thin, and weaken its empire while expanding French influence in the Atlantic. Versailles began moving quickly. Clandestine shipments of gunpowder, muskets, and uniforms, which had been trickling into America for months, increased dramatically. Negotiations with the American commissioners accelerated. On February 6, 1778, less than 4 months after Burgoyne's surrender, France and the United States signed 2 treaties, one of friendship and commerce, and another of military alliance. In the second, France recognized the independence of the United States and pledged to fight until that independence was secured. Britain, in turn, now faced the prospect of a war not only in America, but across the globe. What had begun as a colonial insurrection had become a full-fledged international conflict. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. French warships began patrolling the Atlantic, threatening British shipping and forcing the Royal Navy to divert ships from a blockade of American ports. French soldiers prepared to fight alongside Continental troops, bringing with them training, discipline, and material that the Americans desperately needed. Gold and loans from French banks helped stabilize the struggling revolutionary government, allowing Congress to pay soldiers and purchase supplies. The presence of a powerful European ally boosted morale throughout the colonies and convinced many doubters that victory was possible. Britain now faced a nightmare scenario. Its resources, already stretched by the rebellion, were strained to the breaking point as French fleets threatened not just North America, but the Caribbean, India, and even the English Channel. Plans for crushing the rebellion quickly were abandoned as the war expanded into a global contest. Spanish and Dutch support for the Americans followed in the years to come, turning what had once been an isolated colonial revolt into a worldwide struggle that Britain could not control. For the Americans, the alliance with France was nothing short of transformative. It was the moment the revolution shifted from mere resistance to a credible bid for nationhood. The Continental Army, which had fought so often with inadequate weapons, clothing, and pay, now had access to resources that matched, and in some areas surpassed, those of the British. French officers, including the young Marquis de Lafayette, brought valuable experience and leadership, forging bonds that would endure long after the war was over. Saratoga's significance, then, extended far beyond the battlefield. It was not just a victory over Burgoyne's army. It was a catalyst that convinced a great power to commit itself to the cause of American independence. Without that victory, French support might never have materialized, and the rebellion might have withered under the weight of Britain's superior strength. With it, the war became something Britain had always feared. A global conflict it could not fight on every front. France saw in the American struggle a chance to settle old scores, reclaim lost prestige, and reshape the balance of power. And by seizing that chance, it ensured that the fate of the 13 colonies would no longer be decided by Britain and America alone, but by the intertwined ambitions of empires and revolutionaries on a global stage. In the grand sweep of the American Revolution, there were many battles and countless moments of courage, but few carried the weight and consequence of Saratoga. It was not merely a clash of armies on a distant field in upstate New York. It was the moment the revolution changed from a desperate gamble into a historical inevitability. Before Saratoga, the rebellion had often seemed fragile, a bold but uncertain effort sustained by ideals rather than victories. The British Empire, with its wealth, fleets, and seasoned armies, was still widely regarded as unstoppable, and the colonies' chances of independence looked slim at best. Saratoga shattered that illusion. It proved beyond doubt that ordinary men, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and frontiersmen could stand against the greatest military power of the age and prevail. This was the deeper significance of the campaign. The American forces that surrounded and defeated Burgoyne's army were not professional soldiers hardened by years of service. They were citizens who had left their plows, workshops, and trading posts to fight for an idea. The belief that government derived from the consent of the governed and that liberty was worth sacrifice. They were not backed by vast treasuries or centuries of imperial power. They were often poorly supplied, hungry, and poorly clothed. Yet on the fields around Saratoga, they demonstrated a truth that would resonate far beyond the colonies. Determination, unity, and strategic patience could overcome even the mightiest foe. The psychological shift that followed was profound. Across the 13 colonies, news of the victory spread like wildfire, transforming public sentiment. Where once there had been doubt, now there was confidence. Where once people spoke of resistance, now they spoke openly of independence. Militias swelled with new recruits. Communities that had hesitated to commit to the cause found their resolve. And among those already in the fight, morale soared. If Burgoyne's proud army could be defeated, then any British army could be. What had begun as a rebellion against taxes and parliamentary overreach now felt like a war for a nation's birth, and one that could actually be won. The British, too, felt the shift. Saratoga dealt a blow not just to their military position, but to their entire worldview. The Empire's strategy to divide and isolate, to crush the rebellion through overwhelming force, was in tatters. No longer could they dismiss the Americans as disorganized mobs who would scatter before regular troops. They now faced a determined, adaptive enemy capable of fielding disciplined armies and executing coordinated campaigns. And beyond the battlefield, the loss forced Britain into a far more complex and dangerous war. France's entry into the conflict, inspired directly by Saratoga, transformed the struggle into a global contest Britain could not easily win. The deeper meaning of Saratoga was not just an immediate military outcome, but in the way it reshaped the logic of the entire war. It marked a turning point in perception, not only for those fighting it, but for the world watching unfold. The revolution was no longer a colonial rebellion that might be extinguished with enough regiments and cannons. It was now a legitimate war for independence with a real chance of success. The United States, not yet a nation but already a powerful idea, had forced the most powerful empire on earth to its knees on the battlefield. That idea would prove more enduring than any army, more powerful than any fleet. The lessons of Saratoga also endured beyond the 18th century. It showed that wars are not always won by the side with the largest armies or deepest coffers, but by those with a clear purpose and the will to see through. It demonstrated the power of resilience, of adapting to setbacks, learning from mistakes, and refusing to yield even in the darkest moments. And it underscored the importance of unity in the face of overwhelming odds. The Continental Army's victory was not the result of a single battle plan or a single leader. It was a product of countless small acts of courage, cooperation, and sacrifice, woven together into a force that proved unstoppable. By the time Burgoyne's army laid down its arms, the revolution had become something far greater than a colonial insurrection. It was now a movement with unstoppable momentum, a movement that would, in time, give birth to a new nation and inspire others across the world to rise against tyranny. Saratoga was a moment when that outcome ceased to be a distant hope and became a near certainty. It was a day the revolution stopped being a question of if and became a question of when. The British Empire would fight on for years, but the tide had turned. The American cause had crossed a point of no return, and from that muddy field in New York, the path to independence stretched clear and unbroken into the future.